You're watching PowerNation.
Ethanol fuel has some definite benefits, especially for a high compression engine.
We've got a barrel full of race E85, and we're going to see how it performs in our compression obsession small block Chevy.
Welcome to Engine Power. Today we're going to return to one of our funnest builds, our compression obsession engine. This is a 360 cubic inch small block Chevy that turned into a bit of a dyno mule. A dyno mule is an engine that doesn't really have a home or a specific application, but is a great test bed for us to try out new parts combinations, engine theories, or any crazy ideas that we can think of. This one has a pretty unique history, and if you're not familiar with it or you want a quick refresher, here's a look at the evolution of this power plant. The first time we worked on this engine, we wanted to recreate the backyard build experience that many people have at their home. We found a well-used and worn-out engine, then took it, some extra parts, and some simple hand tools outdoors. We gave the engine new seals and valve springs designed for a sportier hydraulic roller cam, and refreshed the cylinder bores with a 320 grit ball hone. We checked the main bearing clearances using Plastigauge and installed a 10,000th under crankshaft kit. We kept the existing pistons, but replaced the worn-out rings. After finishing the top end, the engine fired right up in our parking lot. Back in the dyno cell, the small block made 276 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque. We really enjoyed this build, so after a few months we decided to bring it back to demonstrate the relationship between static and dynamic compression ratio. Since almost everything but the crankshaft would be replaced, the engine was torn down. We used our Sunin SV15 to hone it to 4060 and 210,000. We started with our rebalanced stock crankshaft. This build would increase the static compression ratio to 13.15 to 1 and the dynamic compression ratio to 9.17 to 1. Dynamic compression ratio is the actual compression ratio inside the cylinder after the intake valve closes. We used a TrickFlow TrackMax camshaft to keep it in a manageable range. We chose Icon forged pistons with a 13cc effective dome mounted on SCAT I-beam rods. They received total seal rings with a gas-ported top ring. Comp hydraulic roller lifters were dropped in, followed by TrickFlow's Super 23-degree fast-as-cast 195cc cylinder heads. 7/400 long comp pushrods and TrickFlow 1.5 ratio roller rockers completed the Valvetrain. Next came a TrickFlow dual-plane street burner manifold. Once the engine rolled into the dyno, it received FiTech's Go EFI Classic Black system rated for up to 550 horsepower. This power plant cranked out 413 horsepower and 424 pound-feet of torque running on pump gas. Then we gave it 118 octane oxygenated race fuel, adjusted the timing, and swapped in a bigger TrickFlow TrackMax camshaft, which was degreed to maintain a similar dynamic compression ratio. The work paid off, increasing our small blocks numbers to 480 horsepower and 474 pound-feet of torque. This engine ran really great on the dyno, and because we were using race gas, we could really optimize the timing and the fuel. Normally, in a conservative pump gas tune-up, the top of the piston will have a nice thin layer of black carbon. But because we weren't worried about the fuel's octane or its quality, we could really get after the tune-up, and that's pretty evident by the top of the pistons because there's not a lot of unburnt fuel left over. Clearly, the induction package is missing from this engine, and we actually robbed it for another project because it was a great combination. But that gives us an awesome opportunity to try something that you guys actually requested. Today, this engine is going to get a high-flowing induction system, a solid roller valve train, and we're going to run it on a fuel that we haven't actually messed with in a while, E85. All that should add up to a high compression, high RPM bullet in the dyno. But before we can do any of that, we do have to tear it down just a bit more. As always, we'll check the oil for any debris or metal. Since this engine only has several hours of dyno time, we expected it to be clean, and it is. Since we're swapping the camshaft, we'll tear down the front of the engine. We'll be reusing all of these parts, so we'll be gentle and keep everything in order. To take off the front cover, we don't need to remove the oil pan, but we'll drop it enough to easily slide off the timing cover. This camshaft doesn't have many hours on it, so we'll save it for a future project. Up next, after an induction swap and an E85 conversion, we'll see if the Chevy puts out the ponies in the dyno cell. That's about as far as we're going to tear down our small block Chevy. We're still going to be using the same rotating assembly, so the cast crank, the I-beam rods, and the forged pistons that we were using before to keep our compression ratio up. We mentioned that we're going to switch it over to a solid roller Valvetrain, and that's all going to start with this cam here. This was a custom grind that we've had on the shelf from a previous project, but it's also going to work great in this application. It has more duration and more lift than the one we just pulled out. Durations at 50 thousandths lift are 252 degrees on the intake, 260 degrees on the exhaust, and they are set on a 110 degree lobe separation angle. Lift at the valve is 653 thousandths on the intake and 660 thousandths on the exhaust. This is really going to complement the higher RPM range and the higher flowing induction that we're going to be using for this combination.
Because this cam was originally designed for another build, it has a 900 thousandths small base circle lobe, which will help with clearance on larger stroke engines. This isn't necessary for this application, but it doesn't hurt either. You can tell by the slight wear pattern on the camshaft it's been used before, but it only has a few hours of dyno time, so no big deal. Even though we're reusing the same timing set, since we changed the cam, we'll re-degree it, setting the intake centerline at 105.5 degrees. After applying orange thread locker, the ARP cam bolts are torqued to 25 pound-feet. In order to check piston to valve clearance, we'll temporarily install a set of lifters, a head gasket, and one cylinder head with checking springs.
Here's one of the benefits to being a pack rat. We managed to find a Jesel Valvetrain setup from a previous project. Admittedly, it's a bit extreme for this engine, but since we have it, we might as well use it. Since this is an adjustable shaft system, we'll follow Jesel's instructions and install the rockers with the adjusters at one turn out from their fully seated position. With a feeler gauge for our cold lash setting between the valve tip and the rocker tip, we'll lengthen the adjustable push rod to take up any remaining lash.
No more in there?
Yep, that's good. Before removing and measuring our adjustable push rods, we'll also use them to check piston to valve clearance. The exhaust has a minimum of 210 thousandths at 10 degrees before TDC on overlap, and the intake has a minimum of 122 thousandths at 10 degrees after TDC on overlap. This setup has plenty of room, but it's something that should always be checked. Now with the rockers removed, we'll take out the adjustable push rods and measure them. 8 inches dead on the nose.
Exactly what I have too.
After the lifters are thoroughly cleaned, they are soaked in break-in oil for a couple of hours to properly lubricate the roller wheel. We found our lifters at Summit Racing Equipment. They are a set of comp cams and Durex solid rollers for a late model 300 thousandths taller lifter board.
We wanted to tighten up the quench area, so we chose a 4060 bore by 23 thousandths compressed thickness Cometic MLS head gasket. Combined with our AFR heads, this gives us a measured static compression ratio of 13.36 to 1. Speaking of cylinder heads, we picked up a set of AFR 220 eliminators at Summit Racing Equipment. They have 220cc intake ports that are fully CNC'd. They have a 2-100 intake valve and a 1-600 exhaust valve housed in a 65cc fully CNC'd combustion chamber. They're torqued in 3 steps to 70 pound-feet. It's important to use the supplied Jesel head bolts to clear their rocker stands. After spraying some comp Valvetrain assembly lube, we'll slide the timing cover on, bolt it back in place, and refasten the oil pan. Then we'll reinstall the Summit Racing harmonic balancer. Because we're increasing the RPM range significantly, we wanted extremely accurate ignition timing. For that, we'll use this MSD 7-inch flying magnet crank trigger assembly. This kit was designed for a small block Chevy, so it's super easy to install. The non-magnetic pickup is set to the specified gap of 50 thousandths.
To install the rocker stand, we'll just run down the bolts loosely so we can put on a set of rockers to align the rocker tips to the valve stems. Once it's set, we'll tighten the stand, remove the rockers, and torque the stand bolts to 65 pound-feet. The bolts have sealer on them since some of them intrude into the intake port. The push rods receive assembly lube and are slid into place. They are 3/8 in diameter with an 80 thousandths wall thickness for extra rigidity and decreased deflection. The rockers are 1.5-to-1 ratio and they are torqued to 26 pound-feet. Cold lash is set to 10 thousandths on the intake and 14 thousandths on the exhaust. This LSM valve lash adjustment tool has a built-in torque wrench to make the job easier.
After laying down our usual beads of silicone, an Edelbrock Super Victor intake manifold from a previous project drops on. We'll leave the fasteners loose enough to adjust the alignment of the intake manifold to the cylinder head's ports. Then the manifold is tightened down. After a generous coating of Valvetrain assembly lube, the Summit Racing valve covers slide on. The gear on the MSD crank trigger distributor receives the included break-in lube, then it's installed and aligned with a number 1 cylinder's terminal. Something like that. Coming up, we roll our small block Chevy into the dyno, then fuel it up and fire it up.
One of the last things we need to do before we can run our engine is switch out the fuel to E85. Because the level of ethanol in pump E85 is very inconsistent, we're using racing E85 for our dyno testing. Because we need a lot and it's significantly cheaper than racing gasoline, we bought a full barrel at roughly $8.50 a gallon.
For fuel metering, we chose this QFT 850 CFM E85 drag race carburetor that we got straight from Holley.
In a carbureted application, it's relatively simple to switch from pump gasoline to E85 because you can change out the carburetor or convert it. And the biggest reason most people switch to E85 is its naturally higher octane level, usually well over 100, while the best you can usually get at the pump for gas is 91 or 93 depending on where you live. This is going to be a lot better in higher cylinder pressure applications to help keep the engine away from detonation. It does come with some negatives though, namely E85 takes up to 34% more fuel because it has a lower stoichiometric ratio than pump gas, which is usually 14.7-to-1, while E85 is around 9.7-to-1. This means a lot more fuel has to enter the engine with the incoming air.
To accommodate for all of that additional fuel flow we'll need, we'll have to make some changes up top. This is the same thing structurally as a carburetor for gasoline, but with some distinct differences. It is set up on the jets, air bleeds, and particularly the metering blocks to handle the additional fuel flow. This carburetor is set up to run right out of the box, but for our particular application, it will probably require some additional tuning. Like in our previous dyno tests, we're running Hot Shot Secret 10W30 Adrenaline R3 racing oil. It contains FR3 friction-reducing additive designed for wear protection. That's great for this engine, especially because it will lead a hard life as a dyno mule.
Well, we got our high compression, high RPM, small block Chevy 360 on the dyno, and we have the corn juice flowing through it. We've already gone ahead and burned the paint off the headers, but we haven't actually made any full bore hits. So we're gonna have to see what this thing actually does. It should make a lot more power because we really up the induction, but the short block is still the same and we still have relatively the same amount of compression, so it'll be pretty interesting, right?
Every time we do this, we have to do a keep its guts run, right? So
yeah, I mean,
we're gonna
go start out relatively low and safe. So.
Yeah, so we're gonna go 3,500 to 5,500 at 600 a second, just to see where we are.
Not bad. You can see it's definitely trending up. 424 horsepower and 405 pound-feet. So, and now that we've really stepped up the induction package and the Valvetrain, you know, with the solid roller cam and stuff, that whole RPM range where it makes power is going to shift dramatically up. So like we're really low right now. I'm
going to probably start the actual poles at, I would say 4,000 because this is a dyno mule.
Yeah.
It doesn't have an application other than it is a learning tool. This is like everything else that we do. We're here to learn with it now. Can we apply stuff from this engine to other things? Of course. Yeah. But this is something where we wanted to actually see what E85 does, and we with better induction, a little bit better cam. Now the kicker on this baby is stock block, stock crank.
I know that's going to be interesting once we start, getting into higher power levels. Like, don't know how that's going to hold up, but it's going to be interesting.
Ooh, wow. It's still going up too.
Yeah.
It's still going up. At 360 inches, we're making 547 horse pressures and 469 pound-feet of torque.
It's corn.
It's corn.
Wow, okay.
What's the first thing we normally do? Is jam all of some timing in it, right? I know it's a huge jump, but we already kind of know what the short block is. Yeah. Cam is slightly different profile, but solid roller. Jump her right up to 35 degrees.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. What do you feel about a stock crank at this kind of power level going 7,000?
I mean,
what's the worst that could happen?
It comes apart, and we have to clean up the mess.
Dyno mule.
I guess.
Sometimes you have to clean up after the mule.
I mean, that's the great part about a dyno mule is that we could do this stuff and kind of push it to the limit and see what happens. So
we're not going to push it till it shows its guts, but
no,
not intentionally anyway. All right, here we go to 7,000 with more timing. Wow. 7,000 stock crank.
Dang.
We're not scared. 477 pound-feet of torque. 567.
At 6,800.
Okay,
Wow.
that's like threshold, right?
I know, that's like right where we wanted it to be.
We figured it was going to make max power in or around 7,000,
Yeah.
so I'll take that.
Heck yeah.
Oil pressure is still great.
157 per cube.
Ooh, okay.
Getting somewhere. That's cool.
157 per cube.
All right. I mean, that's a huge improvement over what we had before.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
like even with like the big cam and the race gas in it, it made like 472 horsepower, I think.
Something.
Right?
Yeah, so we're almost 100 up everywhere.
Yeah.
Now,
That's awesome.
I'm sure there's more in it. We're gonna
Yeah.
look at some things on the tune-up side, some spacer stuff. So
Start fuzzing on it and
fuzzing on it. That's my favorite term.
Up next, we find the best spacer for our small block Chevy the old-fashioned way, by process of elimination. All right, so we still have our 35 degrees of timing, same tune-up in the carburetor, but we added a 1-inch 4-hole tapered spacer. We're gonna see what it does for power and see what she does.
Yeah. Let's see what that did. All right, 571, 480,
All right.
little bit of torque, right?
A little bit.
Little bit of torque, which, yeah, no, that's
I'd
like
call that a pickup.
That's
yeah.
like up everywhere.
Yeah.
Not crazy, but
No, but I mean it's a relatively easy change, and you get a decent amount of power out of it. To see that everywhere, that's that's big.
yeah.
Heck yeah.
You never know how a spacer will perform until you try it. So we tried several different designs and discovered that the 2-inch tall 4-hole tapered spacer works the best. We haven't actually touched the carburetor yet, so the fuel was close enough out of the box. I think we're going to tune on that when we get more time. But as far as like the spacers and everything, I think this one's going to be the heat. So. Not bad.
Not bad.
576.6, 485 pound-feet of torque.
Dang. Oh, so overlay that with what we started with before we did all this spacer swapping and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, so now solid.
Wow.
Solid.
See, yeah, that's cool because you can see a solid gain everywhere, and all we did was take 20 minutes and try a couple different spacers real
Right.
quick. I mean, average, that's going to be up between 5 and 10 over the whole pool. So that's pretty cool. That's easy power right there.
That's easy
And
power.
it just takes a little bit of time.
And now, comparatively speaking to where we started with the other manifold, the other head and all that stuff, bunch of changes. We've changed the operating range of the engine, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But essentially, at peak power, we're up, give or take, we're up 100 horsepower.
Yeah.
And we could put this thing back on gasoline if we wanted to.
I mean, we could. It wouldn't be super hard to take some compression out, put it back on gas, but we do have an entire barrel of E85, so we might as well use some of it. Yeah, I think there's, like you said, there's a ton of opportunities for tech here, and there's all kinds of stuff that we could try.
Sure.
And honestly, we're going to run out of time.
Well, we run out of time every time.
Yeah.
We wish we just dynoed the whole time but we have to have something to dyno.
Yeah.
So this one turned out nice. For what it is, this is the big thing. Stock block, but the stock crank.
Turning 7,000 and making 1.6 per cube.
Yeah, no,
that's pretty crazy.
Good. Now on our torque number, we're at 135 per cube.
Yeah,
we are putting parts on and doing these things so people don't have to.
Exactly.
If we're designing an engine to do specific things, that's one thing. But we are literally changing out parts to show how they affect the entire package.
Yep.
If this was built for a race car of some sanctioning body or whatever, we'd build it obviously different. But these are parts that are put together that gives a general cross section of a compression high performance engine.
Yeah.
And I think we did a good job in showing some really cool things, especially and it was just going to get better. We're going to show more. So
yeah.
Great success.
To see more cool engine builds and dyno tech, go check out PowerNation.